and we will get started with our content. We're excited to have you join us for a new practitioner's guide to IEP referrals. Thanks again for being with us today. I'm Sarah Plunket. I am a speech-language pathologist and have been for 17 years. The math always surprises me when I do that introduction. I have experience in a variety of settings, but also contracted with eLuma as an SLP for a couple years before transitioning to my role as clinical services specialist here. We also have Cami Bible, an occupational therapist, and our clinical services manager here at eLuma helping moderate our chat today.
And I'm Kay Kelly, a school psychologist. It's easy for me to do the math after Sarah because I'm one less. So 16 years in the field, most of that time all that time in public education in the Midwest states. So happy to be here too.
So we'd love to get to know you guys a little bit as well, and know what disciplines we have with us today. This is always a really interesting one for us to see who all is here. So awesome. Kind of even across the board so far. That's great. Wonderful. Well, welcome again. Glad to
All
have you.
related service providers then. So good.
Yeah, that's a good mix. Awesome. And what type of schools are we working with today? Wonderful. Lots of public schools, some virtual, some charter schools too. Great. All right. And how about grades? This is always an interesting one for me too. I know a lot of us work kind of across the board, K through 12, but we'd love to know what grades you work with as well. Very evenly spread out here. Awesome. All right. And how about your knowledge of IEP referrals? We always like to do this to get started because then we'll kind of compare again at the end. We'd love to just know how you rate your knowledge of IEP referrals with our emojis here.
Okay, kind of right in the middle.
Yeah, right in the middle. That's good. Well, we're excited to present on this today. So here is what we're going to learn today. You can find these outcomes as well listed in your handout, but as an engaged participant, you'll walk away with knowledge on how to describe 3 purposes of an IEP within the context of FAPE. Utilizing some case studies, we will write present levels and SMART goals for demonstrations within different disciplines, and also identify 5 parts of finalizing and implementing an IEP. So we're going to get started here. We do have a lot of material to cover, and we want to make sure we have time to cover that and also answer any questions that you have. So we're going to get started with a quick Slido exchange. This is a way for us to prioritize outcomes for today. We'd love to know what you are most excited to learn about. So you can rearrange these outcomes in order of what you are most interested in learning today. And these are all things that we are going to get into. So very good. We do have a lot on present level, so I'm glad that's yeah, very good. Looks like kind of a good mix of all of these. There's a lot to consider with IEPs and the IEP process. So we're going to get into all of those today.
Okay, well, I can go ahead and start us off here. I know that we're happy to talk about the IEP process today. The IEP is upheld by law, so specifically it's under the Law Individuals with Disability Education Act. That law in particular has been a little bit more present in some of the public media this month. There was a very public announcement of some reductions in force at that federal office, particularly in the offices of special education and Office of Civil Rights. And those are the offices that helped hold accountability of the IEP process in the under IDEA. And they've done a wonderful job over 50 years of really providing a lot of deep roots in advocacy for some language that we'll use throughout not just the webinar today, but that have kind of become part of that IEP process that we hold up, you know, pretty wonderfully, I hope, in terms of serving students with disabilities in our schools. So terms like free and appropriate public education, or FAPE, and least restricted environment, those are two of those pillars coming out of IDEA that we utilize in our IEPs, and we'll cover those today as well. And not only accountability and support and guidance for staff and educators, but for parents too. Those rights are really associated with some improved access for students. So we've seen over 50 years of IDA impact increased graduation rates. They've really fostered that inclusive classroom collaborative teaching movement, and then they're there to elevate student voice and family engagement. So IDA is very supportive of parent participation. So it's a good day to kind of learn about that full IEP process. It's our way of upholding IDEA as team members, and happy to talk about it today. If you're interested in doing any more outside of the webinar today to uphold IDEA through the federal agency, the Office of Special Education, and you're interested in any links to like easy access to contact your representatives, you can message us, and I'll be happy to send those links on. But today we'll get started with the IEP process. An IEP stands for Individual Education Plan or Program. Sometimes you'll hear it as a program, kind of depending on the region. It is a legally binding document. It's going to outline a student's special education program. It's upheld by the Individuals with Disability Education Act. And IDA was enacted to ensure that children with disabilities receive a free and appropriate public education. We do have a slightly guided structured notes for that participant worksheet. So if you want to follow along with those, we have a couple answers there. IEP stands for Individual Education Plan or Program, and it's upheld by the Individuals with Disability Education Act. Before we dive in it too deep, we'll clear up just a couple acronyms that sometimes get used alongside IEP. Sometimes we'll see an IFSP, that's an Individual Family Service Plan, and that's really available for our infants and toddlers. So that is a plan based kind of on age. The IEP is available for students that are eligible age 3 to 21. And so when we're serving that younger age group, you'll see it under an IFSP. Similarly, we sometimes see 504 plans and IEPs kind of coincide together. And in some ways, they're very similar. In some ways, they're kind of different. So an IEP and a 504 are both legal documents available for individuals with disabilities. The IEP is governed under the Individuals with Disability Education Act, and so that is for our students identified with educational disabilities. And they serve students not only with accommodations, but specifically designed instructions. Similarly, the 504 is a legal document, but it's upheld by a different law. 504 plans come out of the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. They have an eligibility route as well, but it's under an impact of major life activities, so versus an educational disability. And students who fall under that have the right to reasonable accommodations. And so you can see how sometimes those could overlap in a school system, but they really are two distinct legal documents being served under two different laws. And we're just going to do a little repetition here to help us with some of this information. Oh, I think we're on the next one. It should be one more, Sarah. Thank you. This is a quiz. And so if you enter your name just one time at the beginning, you'll have access to all the questions.
Awesome. See those names coming in.
So which law governs the implementation of the IEP? We have Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, Americans with Disability Act, Individuals with Disability Education Act, or No Child Left Behind Act.
Our timer's counting down for us here.
Very good. All right. Yep, you guys got it. Individuals with Disability Education Act. That's what is upholding our IEPs. When we look at IEPs, we are going to see a few different types of IEPs. So we have our initial IEPs, which always align with an initial evaluation. So that's kind of nice. They're always going to be paired together. And then we have our annual review IEPs and amendment IEPs. And each IEP follows an IEP year. So if we were doing an example, say I was eligible for an IEP October 2024, that would run October 2024 to October 2025. And then my annual review would take on after that every year, year to year date. So I would be looking to update my IEP in October 2026. An amendment IEP is going to be changes that we do that are in between that IEP year. So say this December, we decide to implement some behavioral health services. I could amend my October 2025 IEP, add those services to start in December, and my annual review would still remain in October 2026. And so they're kind of a year-to-year date, an IEP year. An evaluation results IEP, the evaluations process sometimes is going to prompt an IEP, and sometimes those are going to overlap during your annual reviews. So our evaluation processes, we have our initial eligibility evaluation process, and that will prompt an initial IEP if eligible. We have our 3-year reeval evaluation processes. Those happen at minimum every 3 years. We're looking to see if a student continues to qualify, and that will prompt an IEP. We have those prompts in the evaluation process to open up those IEPs, create annual IEPs for them. It helps us absorb the newest evaluation information, and so that we're always building those plans on the most recent data. Sometimes you'll see in between those 3-year cycles, a need to go off cycle to create an evaluation to gain information for any particular reason. And that, just the same as it does for all the other processes, will prompt an IEP. And so sometimes we're seeing those IEPs at the same time as the meeting or within a window of 30 days to kind of open them up, absorb that information, and make the best possible plan for a student. When we're looking at the IEP, we have 2 main goals. First, we want to establish measurable annual goals, and it's important to kind of adjust our language. We used to have like a de minimis progress line, like standard of care, and that's really adjusted to meaningful progress. So when we're making our goals, we want to have goals that are SMART goals, where we're projecting that progress to be pretty meaningful for the student. And the second one is to outline our services, that service summary, to understand what education, instruction, services, minutes will be served for the school to uphold. And we have a follow-up question here just for some repetition. What are the 2 general purposes of an IEP? To provide therapy and counseling, to establish measurable annual goals and outline service provided, to determine school placement and funding, or to access teacher performance. Very good. To establish measurable annual goals and outline services provided. So when we have a student and they're kind of determined to be eligible for special education, that's when the IEP process is beginning. Each of the areas in which a student qualifies is going to have a part in the IEP, and ideally, the IEP is a collaborative, developed plan between all IEP team members. When we're looking at those categories of eligibility, there's about 13. Some states are going to have 14, kind of depending how they look at primary speech categories or gifted. And sometimes that young child or developmentally delayed is a category that will be in there, but most of the time there's about 13. And this is how a student qualifies to get an IEP. So they have to meet criteria by their state standards of one or more of these exceptionalities before an IEP process can start. That's kind of what prompts it. It's always nice to kind of go into those eligibility meetings where an IEP is going to follow, knowing that not one particular eligibility category is going to determine a student's IEP or placement. And so we do develop each IEP individual to the student. And again, just a little extra repetition here. So which of the following is not one of the 13 IDEA eligibility categories? Autism, specific learning disability, ADHD, or traumatic brain injury. ADHD, very good. Yeah, so ADHD is one of our DSM-5 diagnoses. We do serve a lot of students that are ADHD under other health impaired and sometimes in other categories. And then traumatic brain injury is one of our 13 categories. And so we've had students eligible for services who have met TBI. As we go through the process, this is kind of a roadmap. It's going to hit some of those big stops that we're going to go over. There's lots of parts to ensure that an IEP is complete and that IDA is upheld. And starting off, once eligible, the first thing we're going to do is develop our IEP team. The IEP team is going to comprise some key team members, and some of those are going to be legally required to attend the IEP meeting or have a legal excuser form signed by the parent if they're not able to attend. So kind of going across, we have our parents and guardians or student age 18 or older if they're holding their own rights. And that's going to kind of cover those biological parents, foster parents, legal guardians, students if they're holding their own rights. And so it's always been kind of noted that IDA puts this category first as the team member on the notice of meeting as a way to show the important role in IDA emphasis of supporting strong parent participation. A representative from the school, this would typically be an admin of some sort. We've seen special education directors, coordinators, facilitators, principals, school psychs, lead counselors sometimes are setting in that role. If we're setting in that role, that means that we're able to supervise that the provision of specifically designed instruction that gets drafted is going to be able to be implemented, and that we have an understanding of the school's resources. And that includes financial resources, which is one I always like to emphasize. If you're in that role, you're kind of covering that understanding of it. For our special education teacher role, this is a member who's kind of that expert in specifically designed instruction, accommodations, and modifications. The gen ed teacher is there to provide core instruction, and they're also going to be partially responsible for implementing those accommodations and modifications. We might see other members or team members come to these IEP meetings, and they can provide really beneficial points of view. We might have related service providers. A student might be attending, even if they're not looking at transition. Having students at the IEP meetings can be a benefit. Having others that are just relevant to the family system or the community, language interpreters, child advocates, those are all team members that we've seen that come to these IEP meetings to help kind of provide feedback and understanding of the student. And we have some back-to-back questions here. Which of the following is a required member of the IEP team? The school nurse, parent or guardian, community advocate, or student sibling?
You guys, we keep talking about countdown music. I'm not a singer, but every webinar, I'm like, we should do it.
Okay, parent or guardian, one of our required IEP team members. And one more, a real fast one here. The IEP team must include a general education teacher. True or false? And I'm not trying to trick you on excusal forms.
Just a heads up.
Yeah. So yes, true. We do have to have a gen ed teacher invited to the IEP team, and we like to have them included. So next, we're going to kind of look at developing this IEP. This is a good chunk of time of the webinar, so we'll be on this part for a little bit. But it's what we're going to cover is the present level goals and services, and that's kind of called the golden thread, or referenced as the golden thread. We should have a pretty clear, traceable line from our present levels to our goals to the services. And there's other components of the IEP, and we're going to cover those as well. They're really important components. Some of them are not always applicable, and sometimes they're not even as robust in conversation as some of the golden thread ones are, but we shouldn't be skipping over them. And we want parents to feel like they have a clear understanding of page 1 through the end of their full IEP, of what's involved in there, endorsed or not endorsed. Starting out is the present levels. They come in lots of acronyms. The main part from our present levels is that we're including a scope that is both academic and functional. And what we'll be looking for is their strengths, their areas of improvements, and kind of how that manifests in the school setting. So here, a clinician should really be looking to document the current academic achievement and functional performance. That functional performance revolves around non-academic skills that might be necessary for life satisfaction. So if we're thinking of interpersonal skills, executive functioning skills, motor skills, living skills, all those are part of that scope of educational progress. And that's what we want to see in the present level. If you're developing that initial IEP, a lot of this information is going to come from your initial eval. And then for our annuals, a lot of this information is coming from those team members as we're kind of collaborating on updating the plan. When we're going over the present levels, some things we want to keep in mind is using our documenting strengths and areas of improvement. Using understandable and inclusive language is helpful, and then focusing on both the academic and non-academic. I think this is the best place to kind of document parent concerns as well. That's not always on every IEP template, but I found this is the best area when you're going through the IEP that has the most organic conversation to add that in there. If we're reviewing or referencing the APA Inclusive Language Guide, when you're writing your present levels can be really helpful. We've linked this in your participant handout, as well as some other resources and links to experts in the field of trauma-informed language and neuro-affirming language. And those are really helpful for describing some of our behavior and social emotional skills in areas of improvement. So you can see just a few of the examples we have here as ways of kind of alternating our language to write a more inclusive present level summary. So when we start out, the first thing we're going to work on is strengths, or what you might hear as can-do statements. If you can add a source of data, I think that's great. If we're writing that it's a teacher report observed in the classroom, based on a screener, even in the areas of strengths, it's nice to pair your evidence to sources. So they should be identifying both academically and functional strengths, as well as areas of strength in the category of the eligibility. So an example of that might be if we had a student who was specifically like a specific learning disabled student, and the subcategory was basic reading, we would likely see strengths in lots of areas, but we also want to make sure that we're writing strengths or what they can do within that range of basic reading. So maybe they're able to do some early phonemic awareness or some blending, but not segmenting. So trying to find those areas in the category of eligibility is helpful as well. When we're looking at areas of improvement, this is where we're going to be looking at their areas of adverse impact. So most of the time we're looking at deficits and weaknesses. Trying to find a term that works best for you has been really helpful. I like the term areas for improvement. That's the one I kind of adopted. But there's lots of ways to say neutral or positive phrasing for words like deficit or weakness. So if you're following along on your worksheet, the key word there is improvement. We're going to follow up just with a question here. Which statement best describes a student's challenge in the present level summary? We could be making a list of what the student refuses to do, negatively critique the student's behavior, identify areas needing support in a positive way, or listing students' strengths only. Very good. Okay. So part of the present levels, and I've seen them in different places, like sometimes they'll be in the present levels, and sometimes your standards are connected to your goals. So they're kind of in that goal area. They're like a little bridge between getting us from that present levels to our goal. So academic goals, most of the time, those are getting related back to your state and core curriculum standards. But we also have ways to kind of connect our behaviors and social emotional strands as well to standards. So if we're taking those present levels, that area of need, trying to connect it to a standard. If your district and state has counseling strands, those are wonderful to use. If not, using something like the CASTLE framework has really good standards around some of those areas. And that can be a nice way of linking your present levels to that next part of the thread, which is goals. The last part here for present levels is kind of writing up your educational impact statements. The impact statement is going to kind of describe that disability and how it impacts their access to the gen ed setting, maybe what it looks like next to their peers, or like just overall how it's manifesting in the school system. A good impact statement is going to describe those areas of need as in a parent-friendly language, connect it to that adverse need from your eligibility eval to see how and where it kind of works at the school. So it's helpful to kind of include educational context sometimes. So if we're needing to maybe write in the classroom setting or in the lunchroom or when moving throughout the building, some of those phrases helps place that in the school setting and gives it that educational context. The bottom half of that screen there is just kind of putting into order something you might hear. So I'll read some of this data that was sent in and how it's collected. And then on the next slide, we'll kind of put it together into like our own educational impact statement. So we might receive some information where a kindergartner was being observed for some possible occupational therapy services. And the data that came to us said that they were aiming to cut out shapes using standard scissors. They scored very low on a scissor skill screener. During an observation, it was indicated the student showed challenges when cutting along a straight line, noting a possible area of improvement with bilateral and hand coordination. And the initial eval stated that the student had an educational disability category of developmental delay. So if we went to the next slide, we might see an educational impact that kind of looks like this. So I'll let you guys kind of read through that, but it's just taking that information and putting it into the context of how it might manifest at the school. I do think using AI has been extremely helpful for kind of putting together these definitions on education impact. We have lots of ways of collecting data, and the prompts now are really helpful in that we can get a really exact summary based on our state definitions. And we can also ask it to prompt us, are we using any ableist language? Is there anything connected here that's not aligned with a source, a data source? And so it can prompt you to make a really thorough education impact statement.
Awesome. Thank you, Kay. We're going to look at present levels now from a speech language perspective. We're trying to cover kind of different perspectives here during this webinar. So Tim is a second grade student identified with a speech language impairment. He demonstrates strengths in visual learning, utilizes visual aids and graphic organizers in class independently. Academically, he shows strengths in math, particularly if he's using manipulatives. He demonstrates educational impact in receptive and expressive language skills and does benefit from support in the classroom, particularly for tasks involving multi-step directions, as well as verbal and written expression. So that would be that can do. Now, if we look at the need and like that impact, his language impairment affects his involvement in the general education curriculum, and that includes his ability to communicate in the classroom and also socially with his peers. Tim does benefit from repetition as well as cues for comprehension of instructions, maintaining conversations with peers, and then targeted interventions are essential to his success within that educational environment. And then if we look at that educational impact that, Kay was referencing earlier, Tim's language impairment impacts his access to that general education curriculum by limiting his ability to understand and respond to verbal as well as social information. Also things like interpreting cues, engaging in group learning. So this would affect his participation in activities that might require reciprocal communication, comprehension of discussion, questions, peer interactions, specialized instruction, structured support, and visual aids all help him access that general education. So just some examples here, again, of what that might look like. And so now we're going to use the worksheet and kind of pause and reflect. You can reference that section of your participation worksheet and then think of those areas of strength. And we've got it up here. I like how Slido enables us to do this. So you have, that present levels there. We're going to think of those areas of strength. I see some people typing here. And these are all really important. I love the slide that Kay was discussing on that inclusive language. I think it's really neat to see, just for me in the years that I've been working and that shift and how we say things and how we use some of those things. So very good. Sorry, guys. I think my monitors are having a Monday on a Wednesday. All right. Good deal. Yeah, I still see some people typing there.
Those are great.
Yeah, good ones. And what about areas of improvement? So again, we're looking at where we can put some supports in. Where do we need that help and that assistance? Yeah, absolutely. Some of the things that were referenced there for sure. And the peer interaction and peer relationships, I feel like is that's definitely an important thing to note. Yeah, wonderful. Awesome. And how about areas of educational impact? Sorry, we'll skip ahead now. That was a great exercise to kind of pause and reflect on some of those things. And once we have identified those students' present levels, it is time to develop those goals. And so we know that that is a very important part. We have our annual goals that are made up of those academic or functional skills that a student can accomplish within that IEP period. Annual goals should always focus on knowledge, skills, behavior, strategies to address those areas that are preventing the student from progressing in the general education environment. A good way to remember all of those elements in a quality goal is to use the acronym SMART, which stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. And so we're going to talk more about this on the next slide. So keep that in your mind. But goals can include short-term objectives or benchmarks. Short-term objectives or benchmarks break down each goal into a few measurable short-term steps for those students. And so we mentioned those SMART goals, and here we are. This is a good visual for that. SMART goals are those that are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. And those SMART IEP goals can really help students get the most out of their special education program. So the goal is going to be realistic for students. It's going to be something that they are able to achieve, and it's also going to lay out how they're going to accomplish that. IEP goals should never be vague or general. The SMART IEP goal will always say when and how often the student's progress is going to be measured. IEP goals also need to be stated in a way that anything like a standardized test, curriculum-based measurement, screening, any other tasks can measure that. And so we'll do a test your knowledge here, just a recap of information. SMART is an acronym for subjective, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. True or false? All right. So this one is false. We have, sorry, that is messed up. The S will be for specific. And that S, again, as we just mentioned, is for specific. So the goal needs to specifically name the skill or subject area and that target result. So details matter here. We might have a non-specific example that says something like the student will produce all letter sounds accurately. So we've got a very generic situation there. A better example might be the student will produce the following age-appropriate phonemes, something like K and G, with 75% accuracy in positions of words. So we've got specifics, we've got a percentage there, we've got the position of words, things like that. And the next is measurable. The goals should be stated in a way that your student's progress can be measured by that person. And I think this often helps too if you have a situation where maybe therapists are sharing a caseload or something like that. You always want to make sure that whoever might be looking at this understands exactly what's happening and is able to clearly see, what the students are working on. So this can be done using standardized tests, those curriculum-based measurements that we mentioned, screening, other data, observation, anything like that you could gather during treatment sessions. So a non-measurable example might be With the aid of a calculator, Emma will be able to solve math problems. So again, we've got a very kind of vague statement there, but measurable might include with the aid of a calculator, Emma will be able to solve math problems that involve computation of fractions and decimals with 75% accuracy. And then A is for attainable. The goal must represent realistic progress. So the student is going to make that progress within the IEP timeframe. So if we had a non-attainable example, it might say something like Jackson will write a grade level passage with 100% legibility for handwriting. That's not attainable. That wouldn't be attainable for most people. Attainable might mean Jackson will write a paragraph with at least 5 sentences with 85% accuracy for letter formation and spacing. So we've got a more attainable percentage and also some specifics there of what he's going to work on. And the next is relevant. Goals should be relevant to the student. We really need to clearly lay out what the student is going to do to accomplish this. They should be educationally relevant, academic, or functional in nature. This should incorporate some grade level standards or developmental norms. We also want to factor in their current progress and also those present levels that we've been talking about. A non-relevant example might be during classroom writing, Dana will copy sight words. But a more relevant example could be during a classroom writing assignment, Dana will print her name with upper initial letter and lowercase letters based on the Common Core for kindergarten students where they should be able to print many upper and lowercase letters. And finally, we have time-based. The goal needs to include a time frame in which the student will achieve it when given the right supports and services that we've outlined. It's also going to state when and how often progress will be measured. So a non-time-based example might say, Jeremy will be able to orally define class vocabulary words with 90% accuracy. But if we put the time-based element in, we would say, by May 15th or by the end of the IEP period, something like that. Jeremy, will be able to define those words with that accuracy. Many IEP systems will require that the goals are written in a specific format, including, baseline data, the general area of the skill need or specific task. So you always want to make sure to check with your case manager at your school or check, within that IEP system to just make sure when you're writing your goals there. And you can use this guide when creating a goal. I love this. There's a lot of great kind of prompts here for us as well. So these components can be written in a different order, to fit those specific IEP systems that we mentioned. Many times the time frame for the long-term goal will be that next annual IEP. The benchmarks or objectives can be at progress reporting periods, and those are those smaller steps that we're going to do to complete those long-term, goals or meet a general discipline-specific goal, like classroom skills, tool use. That might include, coloring or drawing, cutting, things like that. The skill mentioned can be specific or more general, but will be specific to that setting or context. So you might also reference a specific task, as Kay mentioned earlier, like when giving a classroom writing assignment or getting that specific there. And then when you include measurement and also accuracy in your goal, be sure to consider who will be monitoring that data. So are you going to have a paraprofessional use a data tracker, or will this goal be measured while they're in a therapy session, something like that? And then we also want to consider how it's going to be tracked. Also consider any support that the student will be receiving, prompts, cues, any other assistance. And before we write some goals ourselves, which we're going to look at here in a bit, ASHA, AOTA, and APTA, the joint statements, they have a joint document, all of these governing bodies with their opinions on writing interdisciplinary collaborative goals for IEPs. I love this aspect. I'm a big fan of collaboration. I think it benefits the team and benefits the students. And so this document just highlights a process for IEP team members to collaborate on these goals. All of it is aimed to support those students. And so these organizations say they are committed to and encourage, quote, interprofessional collaboration to maximize outcomes for students across the lifespan. In the school-based practice, one element of this might be the development of collaborative student-centered goals. where interprofessional skills and knowledge are all integrated to facilitate the students' access to and participation in that educational program. So this, as I said, I think it really benefits students. It facilitates collaborative goal development by encouraging team ownership of goals. It promotes the connection between contributions of different team members and those academic and functional goals. And then it's going to foster skill generalization. That's all of our main aim, right? So through the development of those skills across environments with a variety of different people that the students are working with, this is all really going to benefit those students. And in that joint statement, they recommend using this collaborative writing process. So we've already practiced a little bit with those educational impact and kind of writing present levels. And we can just see on this slide how each team member might work on that specific area of need. So if a kindergarten student was struggling with, a math assignment that uses manipulatives, these are just a few different ways. I can, just let you guys see that there. But the main difference in collaborative versus discipline specific is that once these are determined for each needs area, the team is going to come together to collaborate on the goal, determine how each provider is going to support that student in meeting those goals. And then providers should collaborate when documenting too. We're going to collaborate to develop, a data collection, analysis type system to track that progress and make those informed decisions about any interventions or service provision, goal achievement. So collaboration is definitely the name of the game. Please be aware there might be different state-specific Medicaid requirements for goals and documentation. So that is just something to be aware of. So now we're going to look at writing some of our own goals. We're going to fix a couple of things that might need some help. And so we're going to get into some practice here.
Yeah, and this first one here is kind of looking at maybe an educational counseling goal. And so if we're kind of looking, like this could be a good goal, we want to make sure it's a SMART goal. And we use that little grid on the side there, maybe trying to identify a part that is missing. And you can put that in the chat. You guys have been great in the chat, putting in answers there.
Yeah,
Slide those up if you want to see some populate there. I can see specific. That's not quite what I was going for, but now that somebody said it, target behaviors, I could see being specific. We have a couple more people typing. I'm going to let them get in. And then I'll reveal what I was thinking. This is why it's so good to have the collaborative piece.
That's right.
Yeah, I see now that their answer is like, because typically when I would write it, we would write target behaviors and then we would write the three that, well, not always three, but like maybe the ones we were looking at. And so the audience is right. I'll share my answer, but I definitely feel like there's some good thoughts going on in there. I put in setting our context. What I was looking to see is maybe a goal where it said within an IEP year, Sharon will decrease target behaviors in her core academic classes. So maybe I would be looking to collect data just in some of these core pieces versus all day at this time, as measured by daily frequency count from 15 to 1 or less. When given a reminder of that behavior. But I do like the audience feedback in there. I didn't get to check the chat, but the Slido was very thoughtful.
Awesome. So we're going to look at one here. Again, we're just looking for maybe something that's missing here. If you think of things that we've talked about already and what you might add to this here. I see some people typing, so we'll wait for that. Yeah, thank you guys. The chat is active, Slido's active. We really value and appreciate that collaboration and feedback for sure. Yeah, absolutely. This is pretty general, it's pretty broad. So yeah, it's missing that measurable data. Like what are we looking for? How are we going to measure this? So yeah, you guys got it. Absolutely. Now that we've looked at kind of fixing, for lack of a better word, a couple of goals here, we're going to look at a case study and also write our own SMART goal. So you can see it here up on the screen. We're going to allow some time for this. I'll try to get through the highlights here, but Kara is a first grade student with Down syndrome. We've got some things that she enjoys here. Again, talking about those strengths, things that she enjoys doing, that she's able to do well. She has a receptive and expressive language disorder as well as some phonological errors. So we've got some baseline data for her here in this first paragraph. And then our areas of support. She does need some support with muscle tone and fatigue. She's able to do certain things with grasp and different things focused more on the OT side. She does have some accommodations there for seating. She does need some support during unstructured events in the classroom. She's still developing skills in some areas and needs support for regulation and things like that. And so we're just going to think about writing that, maybe a goal for, and you guys can put that in the chat as well. Just thinking about writing our own. There also is a space on the participation worksheet for that as well.
So as you're kind of wrapping up your SMART goal practice, we've kind of been tying our present levels to our goals. And so the last part of this golden thread is connecting it to our services, which is what we'll cover next. This last piece of service plan, that's really covering our placement, services, related services, accommodations, and modifications. Before diving into a service plan, it's a good time to kind of reflect on the principle of least restricted environment. So IDA makes it clear that every child with a disability must receive their education alongside students without disability to the maximum extent appropriate. And that's kind of known as least restricted environment, or LRE. So we want our students with disabilities given an opportunity to be given appropriate services and supports in the gen ed setting before schools are considering more restrictive or segregated placements. And we'll talk about placements, but it's always kind of nice to clarify that placements is just a term. It's referencing almost like a continuum of support. So LRE isn't a place, it's more of a principle that kind of guides a right for a student to access the gen ed setting. And that placement decision is still a team-based decision. So when we're looking at least restrictive environment and the word placement or continuum support, again, it's not pulled from a particular eligibility access or our one variable. It's still that team collaboration piece. And we'll follow up with this one with a little test your knowledge as well. So what is least restrictive environment? Are we considering that a separate classroom for students with disabilities, a principal ensuring education with non-disabled peers as much as possible, a legal document outlining therapy services, or placement at a specialized school? Yep, very good. So it's not a place for those any options. It's really a principle outlined in IDEA. So the next thing we're going to do is really look at this placement continuum. So when we are building those service plans, we want to see where can we support them on the continuum. And our goal is to educate that child with a disability in the same classroom, and that their education is as similar as possible to their peers to the fullest extent possible. And what that kind of looks like is that 80% higher or 100% higher. So those last two placement considerations is what's considered when we give data to the state as meeting that. So if we're looking at full inclusion or 100% placement in the gen ed, that means the student's plan has no minutes where they're taught in a specialized setting. And those two plans can look really different. So we could have a student who has 7 out of 7 inclusion classes, and they're in the same placement as a student who maybe has 10 minutes of consult each quarter. And so full inclusion, and similar to 80% or higher, it doesn't really equate to a minimal IEP or minimal services. It's really just indicating that that level of restriction is very low. And so if we're looking at a student who maybe has that 80% or more, that means that for 19% of their day or some capacity, there is a portion of their day where they're not learning next to their peers. And again, those plans can look really different. So we could have a student who's maybe taking 6 classes unsupported and 1 hour of resource. Or maybe we have a primary speech student getting pulled from class 30 minutes a week. And so very similar. It doesn't really equate to minimal minutes. It's a different level of continuum support. It's just that their time away from peers is very low. If we're looking at that 40 to 79% placement, it's a really wide range of supports and plans. It could be a mix. It's likely a mix of pull out and inclusion. It wouldn't be unusual to see additional related services in this type of area. And it could represent different plans as well. So maybe we have a student who gets all their core academics in a specialized setting, but they're getting opportunities with their peers in electives and recess and lunch and in the hallway, and all those minutes add up. And similar, it could be the same type of student who gets all their core in the gen ed setting, but maybe comes out for a resource lab and a couple additional interventions 3-4 times a week. So they're right over that 80. So they're at 79 to 78%. And so those plans feel really different. One's very hefty, and then the other one is kind of a more inclusive style to it, but they're not in that emplacement. They're covered under 40 to 79. I know that when we move students, kind of from 40 to 55, that data doesn't get sent anywhere. It doesn't go to the state, and it doesn't support the improvements that you're making for students. But if we're at an IEP meeting and we move a kid 40% to 55%, I think that's really wonderful progress. And that's a significant thing to celebrate. Sometimes we have cases where that gradual transition maybe can lead to a placement change in the future. It doesn't always, but the gradual ones are much easier to move those kids when they're ready versus a major jump of 40 to above 80. Even though I know that the 40 to 55% progress will not be counted in the same way to your state audits as an 80% or higher would. But moving down the line, the service plans under 40, that's really indicating a student has access to a lot of specialized instruction and support for a good part of the day. So they have opportunity to be by their peers, but a lot of times it's like these really small pockets that are kind of adding up. So we're looking at travel time between classes, to and from the bus, maybe lunch and recess, and all those minutes kind of add up to this percentage under 40. If we're looking at those self-contained classrooms, which are typically focused on smaller class sizes, where we can offer that one-on-one attention, an environment where we get to maybe produce a sense of safety and connection. Those are sometimes seen also in support. Sometimes you can see them at their home school, and then sometimes they're under this 100% placement. When we're seeing 100% self-contained, on the support continuum, you might see that as like a public day facility, a private day facility. These are kind of minute to minute restricted from their peers. And so likely not being served at their homeschool campus. And that means their support is all day. So they're getting support from the moment they get off the bus. So maybe they have support from travel time, travel to and from the bus, travel in the hallways, support during hallways, lunch, electives, instruction. It's minute to minute. And sometimes our districts have maybe one program that kind of supports this continuum, this support part on the continuum, or they might not have it in contract with an agency. And that's kind of where you see a lot of the confusion about placement being a location versus a stop on the continuum. Additionally, we have kind of this alternate part on the continuum. It's not always restrictive in the same way, but it's kind of an alternate placement where we maybe have a student who has some temporary medical conditions. They're not able to access the campus right now full time. Maybe you're in a district that has connections and partnerships with the residential hospitals, so you're serving those students during short and term long treatment plans before they return to their school. And so their support kind of looks a little bit more unique than that campus support. When we look at the service plans, they kind of, I think, all look about the same on the IEP records. But what we're likely going to see is that we have our services, the frequency, duration, and that they're standards. Sometimes the standards are connected here. And like I said, sometimes they're in that present level, but we want to have them somewhere to help link that kind of golden thread for our audits. So if we are kind of following that golden thread and we've outlined in the present level those impacted areas and we've set a goal that we think we're going to meet in the next year, then our services should align with that. So I think this is the best place to ask. It comes up really organically when you're talking in an IEP meeting and you're outlining these services. Is there any area of this service plan that this student could be more inclusive or could be more independent? That helps with that gradual transition, and maybe there is and maybe there isn't, but it's still good progress when we can move those percentages and hopefully get to a point where we can get them more access to their peers. Oh, I put two little slides on there on that same slide. Sorry, Sarah, but one is just showing that maybe you have your goals connected and maybe you don't. When we're looking at accommodations and modifications, and I think I've seen this on every IEP, is they're always on the same page and they're kind of said in the same breath. Like, here's your accommodations and modifications, but they're really two separate levels of support. So not every student has these, but if they are recommended for any type of accommodations and modifications, it's helpful as part of the process to identify it with some specifics. So for audits, they're going to want to see frequency and duration and location and being thoughtful about where these are going to happen at. What I think is most helpful for the team is kind of understanding that accommodations are not as supportive as a modification. And so if we have accommodations, those students are really having the same expectation that their peers in class are having. There's just like a small variation of something. So maybe they're doing the same task or test, but they're doing it in a different classroom. Or they're doing the same assignment, but they're getting 1.5 times the time that a typical student would. And so they're still really accessing the same type of learning that their peers are, and the accommodation is just adjusting for a variable to help them access it. Modifications are more supportive because what they're going to do is alter something. And so it might be an alternate assignment. Maybe they're using an alternate book, an alternate grading system. You're rewording the question to make it have simpler language. If you're adjusting the expectation, then that's a little bit more of a support that we're giving to a student. This last part, I know I said it at the beginning. I think it's really important that we don't skip over some of the pieces of an IEP that maybe aren't applicable or weren't endorsed. Highlighting it as that it's not endorsed or it's not applicable is still helpful to have that dialogue in the meeting. Parents sometimes get packets, like the IEP could be several pages long, and they might go over it later and think, well, we didn't cover that section. I don't really know what that means. So I think it's helpful that we're just kind of covering it front to back. And it's good for parents to hear, like, this is something that will come up, the age that they turn 16 or the age that they're turning 17. Or if things change and there's an impact or need for Braille, just know that that would be a question we would ask you. So some of those things are not going to feel that robust. I kind of feel like they're like when you go to a doctor's appointment, they go over your medical history, like we're just clearing these up. These are still the same, right? So I think that's okay to cover those as well. That would be like your dates and your 3-year cycle dates, just knowing those are coming. The roles of the team members there, special considerations, those are the ones that sometimes aren't even endorsed or never endorsed the full time that they're on an IEP. We'll also go over those accommodations and universal tools if your state or district's having any assessments. And then that last one is age of majority. And so I know I looked earlier. I know we have like a lot of elementary in the audience, and that age of majority gets hit pretty frequent at the high school because it happens. It's the letter that's sent to them the year that they turn 17, letting them know they're going to be their own rights holder. But it's okay to still share what that section is. You could say, like, this is age of majority. If your student's on an IEP when they're turning 18, they'll be their own guardian. Or this is something that the high school will be sharing more with you, just so that they kind of understand what that section is on your layout and don't have any questions about it. And then I think we are finally moving on here from our little overnight stay at the development of the IEP. So this last few couple stops here on the roadmap is just kind of following up on that process piece of the official meeting and then kind of putting it all together to be finalized. When we get ready to set up these notice of meetings, finding that time that works for everybody is pretty essential. And then doing it in a formal invite is probably just as essential as finding the right date and time that everybody can meet. The meeting invitation is a formal legal notice and often gets skipped. I think most of the time, like if we were reviewing audits, a lot of those errors come from notice of meeting or PWNs, part of the processing piece. But what's nice about the notice of meeting is it's more fixed. The PWN, and we'll review this a little bit later in some slides, but it's more open. And so there can be a lot of conversation and dialogue that comes about on a PWN, but on a notice of meeting, what we want to make sure is that we're filling out all the details. And most of those details are going to be fixed, like date, time, reason. Each state has a little bit different of an interpretation. And those are really good to know on a notice of meeting. They're typically around how they like to provide guidance on the 2 times of notifying a parent and in which capacities do you want it written and mailed. And if you can kind of know that frontwards and backwards, it can be really helpful. Not only is it going to ensure that you're upholding parent participation, but then it's going to give you avenues for maintaining your timeline compliance because it has within those guidelines ways for you to meet if there's any obstacles that have resulted in a parent not being able to attend or a guardian. When we're looking at kind of producing or facilitating the meeting, we have a couple here. I'll let you kind of read through that. I want to hit a few of them. Advocating for the student, I think most people kind of know that when you come to those disagreements, you kind of always fall back on what's best for the student. Additionally, I think it's been very helpful to have students in the IEP meeting. So I did a lot of student-led IEPs when I was at my middle school and at the high school. And at the middle school, that covered fifth grade transition. So we did go down even farther into the fifth grade. And then when I worked in elementary, now that I think about it, I had a kindergarten teacher. She didn't do student-led, but she did a very wonderful like visual list of like dreams and wants and needs. And so it started out each meeting just like with a very clear student lens, and it's been very helpful. The student-led IEPs, I didn't find them to be time, like something that ate up a lot of time at our meetings. Maybe 4 or 5 minutes. It was a PowerPoint, and it gave the high schoolers a lot of advocacy practice in terms of talking about their disability. Teamwork is really important. I know sometimes we're putting recommendations out there that not everybody's on board with at that time. If you can work together to have some possible solutions at the meeting, that's helpful. We want the meetings to be the most productive. Anytime you can bring your data and documentation to the meeting is helpful. It produces more organic conversation for how you're going to build into goals. That's just what I've found. If we're talking about a student who maybe was receiving speech and language services, and you're showing them the goal progress that they had over the year, it lends itself nicely into what you're recommending for the next year. I do think the best advice overall for kind of facilitating IEP meetings is to do proactive work ahead of time. If we can leverage good practices and transparent and honest communication kind of all year long, then our IEPs are likely to be pretty productive. If we're offering kind of grace and positive intent, that really helps to break down barriers and assumptions that can kind of manifest in our meetings. Oh, meeting notes. I was always a meeting note taker. So I listed just a few here of things to keep in mind if you're doing meeting notes. Part of our accountability to IDA is that we're always offering parents the information they need in their native language or preferred communication. So if I had a parent that kind of requested it be different, I always wrote that in my notes. So, parent requested documentation in English or declined interpretation services, just to document that piece. I think it's nice to go ahead and confirm your IEP roles on your notes. That's a good reminder that if not all the roles are there, that you want to have your excusal form ready, and then have that available so it's all kind of together. Anytime we can document agreement, there's a lot of written stuff in the draft of the IEP. And so what our meeting notes are doing is kind of supplementing that. So all that verbal discourse, maybe head shakes and agreements, as we're going through different sections, those are good to document. Of course, we want to document any disagreements and the discussions around that. For LRE and FAPE, I think the best way to do that is just a nice summary at the end. That's what I typically did, is I would just kind of review everything to make sure that we were in agreement again, and then being able to sign off on it. It was also helpful to have that summary because it was easier to do the PWN if that was kind of already established. Just a few quick don'ts. Having provider names be so specific versus their role. Sometimes staff change during the school year or they're not there the next year, but that role needs to continue. Specific brands, we tend to write out the characteristics of what we want from a device, or whatever that brand is, like what the parts they liked about that, and then trying to meet those needs through the characteristics of it. Any unprofessional language, I think that one's kind of a given, but also be thoughtful about our educational acronyms and jargon. So anybody reading these notes would still need to be able to understand them. So if your district has like shorthand or acronyms that aren't that familiar, I would maybe write them out. The last part here is kind of finalizing that IEP. This comes with the PWN. The PWN is called the prior written notice, and that's the kind of including our procedure safeguards and outlining the information that we're giving parents so that they can make an informed consent. So we are giving them prior written notice if there's an addition to, a change of, a denial of special education, or if we're proposing a change. Those are all things we want to have for our prior written notice. I don't particularly think that's the most friendliest term that kind of encapsulates what it does. So I tended to use like introduce, like we're going to go over the PWN, that's the prior written notice. It acts kind of like an IEP receipt. And I found like parents really found that a lot more helpful. It's showing you what we agreed on. It's giving you notice to what we agreed on and what's kind of different from last year to this year if you are doing an annual. So these PWNs are kind of coming after that discussion has happened, that IEP meeting has kind of closed up. You're writing all of that down. And that at that time, none of those changes have been official. Like this is the form that kind of provides that finalization for you. And it informs parents of their right to due process and it gives them that information that they need to make an informed consent. So I did put two examples up there because sometimes in like on that second example, there's a lot of changes in one annual IEP and we do capture them all. And you can see like each list or each action is going to be tied to an agreement and then to a consideration. And there can be lots of changes and these descriptions can get lengthy. But it's just good to know that this is the form that's going to finalize it and kind of put it into motion. And so, like I said, it's a little bit more open than the notice of meeting. This last piece here is the consent or the parent signature. And so generally, we're gaining these following that IEP meeting on that prior written notice. It's showing us the agreements of the placement and the services. There's IDA writes it in a way that it's as soon as possible, but they don't particularly describe that. And so it's really interpreted in lots of ways of once you sign this, when does it become in effect? And so it's a state guidance. Knowing that is really helpful because it really does vary. Like I've seen within 10 days, within 60 days at time of signing. And so it can really be interpreted lots of different ways by your state. What we want to keep in mind is that it's been fully informed to those parents. So that informed piece has been done, including in their language or preferred mode of communication. That we've sometimes will state most of the PWNs that I've seen kind of have this as a set language in there, but I think it's nice, similar to the IEP, that we review what's on the form so that parents understand that section. But they do have the consent to revoke, so this is a voluntary signature. You can withdraw it at any time. Once they do sign that, those things will come into place. There are additionally, what makes the PWN, I guess more interesting is they have more guidance or regulations around when you would sign. So not every PWN requires a signature. States have provided guidance for different examples in different ways, and then they've set those. And so sometimes you'll see that a PWN isn't signed, but still finalized if maybe the changes from last year to this year were 25% or less, or some states will do like an informed window. And so you will provide all this information. The parent has 10 days to review. If they don't seek due process, then that finalized or that IEP becomes finalized. But there are some actions that will always get signatures. And so that includes anytime it's an initial placement, initial services, or for requesting an eval with assessment. We know that we'll always have a signed consent form during that time. We have just a few follow-up questions, which is good timing. I'm getting a little hoarse. Parent consent is required before implementing initial special education services. True or false? True. Very good. Okay. And the last one here, the IDA mandates that schools provide parents with information, including their meeting discussion, paperwork, parent rights about their child's special education in their native language or other mode of communication. True or false? True. Very good. Those are two important ones. So very good job.